Quatermass. It's a pentacle.
Pentacle?
Those marks. One of the ancient Kabbalistic signs. They were used in black magic.
The demons.
Over a 50-year career, the writer Nigel Kneale has changed the face of television drama with ambitious and unforgettable works such as Quatermass, 1984, The Year of the Sex Olympics, and The Stone Tape.
I think Nigel Kneale is one of the architects of popular television. They're absolutely landmark pieces of TV drama.
Nigel Kneale is probably the most important writer of his type in the world.
His scripts tap into the anxieties of the present and show an uncanny knack of predicting the future.
He had that ability to be able just to think about the present time and then to find a way of telling a story which actually made you stop in your tracks.
I think Nigel should have a 5-minute slot where the epilogue used to be just called I Told You So.
Zero to 30, 40.
Reversal procedure being carried out. Full response.
You see, Blenker, this is the only way we have of checking velocity. Turn it about and fire propulsion units against the direction of the flight.
Gun. Over.
In July 1953, the BBC televised a 6-part science fiction thriller unlike anything they'd shown before. Commissioned at the last minute to fill a gap in the schedule, the serial gave a young staff writer his big opportunity.
I think they decided to make it because they were desperate. And they said, please, can somebody think of something? So I thought of this story. And they said, okay, fine, write it. So I started writing it in some haste. And I got about 4 out of 6 parts written. And then it was on the air.
Kneale's new serial played on popular paranoia.
At that time, I think everybody was worried to bits about what might happen. They knew that very shortly before, the Russians had acquired the H-bomb. That was big stuff, very, very dangerous. At the same time, both the Russians and Americans were working on outer space. They'd stolen, both of them had stolen a lot of old German V-2s and kitted them out as space rockets. And so the knowledge that this stuff existed and could drop anywhere was behind everything.
What is it? What is it? Okay, don't touch it.
I'm going to.
That was a bomb! The thing that always gets me is in the first Quatermass experiment, he actually wrote his own metaphor for what he was doing with the rocket ship landing in the suburban house.
Yes.
And that's what he did. He invented, by shaking it up, popular drama.
The first sort of original television serial and to have mass appeal.
And it was taking American stuff, it was taking American like stuff from films and making it work on television. That level of dynamism that just hadn't really been done before then, I don't think.
In rocket scientist Bernard Quatermass, Kneale created a grown-up hero for a grown-up audience.
Where are the others? Victor! Victor! What happened?
When he wrote the Quatermass experiment for 1953, American TV science fiction was Captain Video, a children's program in which space rangers had cardboard helmets and all that kind of stuff. And so, writing a solid adult, science fiction serial at that time was an unprecedented thing to do.
Although the Quatermass experiment was his first drama serial, Kneale was already established as a successful prose writer with a taste for the fantastic. He'd won the prestigious Somerset Maugham Award in 1950 for a collection of stories inspired by his childhood on the Isle of Man.
They tend to be set in the history of the Isle of Man. He says this is because he didn't want to get sued by setting them in the present and upsetting anybody, but there is an awful lot about sea monsters and kind of the community and the sort of strange isolated community of the Isle of Man. But there are stories as well. There's a story called My Nuke, which is basically about a poltergeist inhabiting a house that an estate agent is trying to sell, which feeds very strongly into what he came to do later.
Kneale's publishers encouraged him to follow up his short stories with a full-length novel, but Kneale had other ideas.
And I looked around at what the new thing was going to be, and it was television, which had just started back into activity after the war. So that gave me a kind of kick. I'd never seen television until then, so it was all new.
But Kneale soon found that not everyone in the BBC shared his understanding of the medium's potential.
It was radio with pictures at best, because the whole outfit of the BBC was run by radio men, insignificant or very important. They could have their power over everybody who wanted to work for them, and they could be very unkind, unhelpful, and thoroughly bastards.
Take it easy, Vic. There's nothing to worry about.
Kneale was to find obstacles at many levels on the Quatermass experiment. He'd injected horror into his science fiction story by having the returning astronaut gradually turn into a giant monster. This proved too much for the BBC's design team.
When they realized that there was a special effects sequence showing a monster growing out of almost nothing in the 6th episode, one of these characters said to me, well, we're not going to do it. He said, you wrote it, you do it. You found them.
There they are. There's the original wiggly gloves, which were the monster, the original monster for the first Quatermass. And I sat with them on my hands like this, and then you stuck all the bits on, including a whole lot of bits which have fallen off, and then you just wear them. Like
this. I had to wear them, and obviously keep a beady eye on the monitor screen, which showed me what he was doing, where he wasn't.
Terrified the entire nation.
Yes.
The final episode of the Quatermass experiment was never kept after its broadcast. But at the story's climax, Quatermass defeats the monster in a way that's both original and cost-effective.
He convinces the monster to commit suicide, and we have this very interesting device that's used in Quatermass and the Pit as well. It almost boils down to an editorial speech by Quatermass representing humanity, or the humane aspects of humanity, and he talks to the monster, and so the monster is defeated by an intellectual argument or an emotional appeal, rather than, as in American-style science fiction, by it being blown up or electrocuted, or having the entire firepower of the army turned against it.
The Quatermass experiment was a certified hit with the rapidly growing British TV audience.
The Quatermass experiment followed pretty directly on from the Queen's coronation, which is the sort of key event, the first event in television history, really. So suddenly there was an audience for television. And the BBC did some research into the final episode of the serial and discovered that a lot of people who'd watched it had actually watched the whole serial, about 3/4 of the group that they'd looked into, apparently. So, it held its audience.
The success of the Quatermass experiment led Kneale and his director Rudy Cartier to take on what would turn out to be one of the BBC's most controversial productions ever.
One or two people had a go at scripting it, and they'd come to nothing in particular. And so then the bosses turned to Rudy and myself as creatures who had done the future in the Quatermass experiment a few months or weeks before. And so they said, well, you could do another futuristic story. and that is 1984.
This, in 1984, is London, chief city of Airstrip 1, a province of the state of Oceania.
1984 was one of the most complex productions the BBC had attempted, and like all TV drama of the time, it was performed live.
In fact, we had 2 whole studios, not just one for the actors, another one for the orchestra, a live orchestra where the conductor was the man who wrote the music and sat there waiting for his cues from the gallery, from Rudy Cartier. Right, music, press button, and out it comes, woof.
No, not don't. Oh, please, O'Brien. What is it you want me to do? No.
By itself, pain is not always enough. Here in room 101, you are meeting the unendurable. Courage and cowardice are not involved. You will do what is required of you.
What is it? How can I do it when I don't know what it is?
You will find that you know.
As with the Quatermass monster, 1984 used a low-tech method to achieve a chilling effect.
This is a mask. It fits over the head, leaving no exit. When the plastic door is raised up, the rats will shoot out like bullets.
Somebody got a makeup girl, and she found a couple of very tame white rats and powdered them down brown. So those were the 2 rats who appeared to threaten Winston. They wouldn't. They didn't. They were friendly. They made friends with Winston. But if you smear apple juice around their cage, the rats lick it, and they look very threatening. Winston was terrified.
No, do it to Julia. Do it to Julia, not me. Julia, I don't care what you do to her. It's Julia. Julia, not me. Not me.
Well, for its time, obviously, 1984 was very, very strong stuff for TV audiences. Especially the end sequences with the rats in Room 101, which, wasn't really the norm for television at the time.
Last night's play insulting to people's intelligence. Shocking bad taste on Sunday night.
We've all come to the conclusion that the persons responsible for putting on the play are sadists and readers of horror comics, and we, the public, will work to get television censored as the films have to be. For weeks on Sundays we have to watch dismal, immoral and sadistically highbrow plays. Thank God for Wilfred Pickles and the Grove family.
There were questions asked in Parliament about it. There were calls to the BBC complaining about it. It was staged once and was due to be restaged again later in the week, but there was real doubt as to whether the restaging would go ahead because it was considered that maybe this wasn't quite the done thing.
But then the word leaked out of Buckingham Palace that the Queen had watched it and liked it. And everything in reverse. They say, this was a great programme, said the press. And the BBC were absolutely right to put it on. And we can't wait to see the second performance on Thursday.
I remember being impressed by this kind of double punch nature of it. The creative confidence of Quatermass Experiment followed the year later by, what should we do now? Ooh, let's do 1984. And questions in the House and why should we have this horror play on television? And an absolutely uncompromising attitude to great telly, great broadcasting and making a statement and not being afraid to deal with these really terrifying and remarkable ideas.
Before we begin the 4th episode of Quatermass 2, we'd like to say that in our opinion it is not suitable for children or for those of you who may have a nervous disposition.
Kneale's next Quatermass serial again tapped into Cold War paranoia. But this time, secret government installations replaced crashed rockets as the source of anxiety.
Surely it's just a refinery.
I hope so.
What else could it be?
I think I'm going mad.
The Americans were putting up all sorts of defensive apparatus and domes containing radar. This was all new. It was all big and not a word was said. It was secret, secret, secret.
The domes turn out to be shelters for an alien race that's secretly taken over the British state.
Certainly Quatermass 2 is the British invasion of the body snatchers, but I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing.
For the past year, this country, and probably others, has been under the influence of... Look, Frank, you'll have to sub this to make it sound right, but... under the influence of something from outside the Earth.
It's a metaphor that always works. What Quatermass 2 does is take that metaphor and apply it to the specific conditions of Britain in the 1950s. Not just the kind of Cold War paranoia, but I think the traditional British grumbling resentment of bureaucracy as represented by the council, or in this case, big business.
The guards came out and took him away, and I wasn't allowed to go with him.
It's a prohibited area. You must have known that.
This is a free country in time of peace. I have certain rights, and I intend to use them.
And of course, this being paranoid science fiction, the obvious conclusion is that what they've done is sell us out to aliens.
Quatermass 2 was another hit, guaranteeing a third series. Kneale had created a national institution.
There was a sense that one had to get home to see it, because you wanted to know what happened next. We hurried home with, I think, millions of other people, and watched it at the same time, and talked about it the next day, and talked about it with your friends, and wondered what was going to happen next. And that was a very exciting phenomenon.
Kneale now had the freedom and the budget to embark on his most ambitious story yet. In the 1958 Quatermass and the Pit, he reinvented the ghost story by suggesting a scientific explanation for supernatural events. This was to become a major theme throughout his future work.
I'd go with those who are anti-superstitious, and that's what I've used again and again in my stories, is that behind the apparently irrational, superstitious, there is something real and true and dangerous.
It's certainly the serial in which Nigel perfects the notion of I suppose, a science fictional detective story. It's a mystery, and we get lots of evidence and historical documentation, and we go. It's very like the short stories of M.R. James do similar tricks of trying to convince you of something that's absurd just by giving you a lot of factual evidence, almost like showing the documents and going looking at the church records and saying not only is this weird stuff happening, but it's been happening for a long, long time.
The ghostly manifestations are connected to the discovery of an ancient alien spaceship beneath London, an event which would have been hard to depict on the lower budgets of the earlier serials.
By this time, the BBC had taken over Ealing Studios. That made a big difference, because it was possible there to use really enormous film studios. The pit wasn't a real pit dug down deep in the earth. You couldn't have that. So the clever designer, Cliff Hetz, they got the same effect by raising the sides of the pit area, so that it appeared to go down, and whereas really all props were going up, and it produced a very good illusion of a pit.
All right, keep going.
The thing about the pit, I think, is that everyone recognises it's like the best of the three, but it's not just to do with them refining the format, as it were, or even the actual idea is the best one. It's so kind of grand and extraordinary. But the production is brilliant. Andre Morel is just perfect as Quatermass, and Cease Linder, and everyone is wonderful, and they're doing it with such absolute commitment, and that's what makes it terrifying.
And the design is brilliant. The design of the creatures and of the spaceship still stands up to this day. It hasn't dated.
It's all right, they're dead. They've been dead for a long time.
He's Quatermass and the pit, isn't he?
Yes.
Which is,
he is
where
a
we
Martian from the pit.
We didn't have to make him. They had actually people to do it then.
Some very expert special effects men.
Yes.
We just could admire the product of these two clever people.
Yes.
And they made this thing which actually could work its own movement without any hands poked through gloves or anything.
Yes.
See, he had 3 legs.
Oh, yes.
He was a tripod structure instead of a quadruped.
It's the Manx influence.
Yeah, well, it could be.
Quatermass eventually discovers that human life itself was sown on Earth by genocidal Martians.
So, in effect, we are the Martians. Now, that is a pretty nasty thought, particularly as the Martians were greatly engaged in killing each other. And suddenly something drifts through, aren't we? And this was a good point, I think, to make, particularly at that time when we were getting the first race riots and so on. And we've had lots since. I think the theme is still viable.
By the 1960s, Kneale was firmly established as one of Britain's leading TV dramatists. He'd also scripted film adaptations of Look Back in Anger and The Entertainer. But he continued to write bold and original television scripts, taking advantage of an increasingly sophisticated audience and better technology.
With technical changes, taping and so on, make it possible to get more into 2 hours than you could in those days. You don't now have to allow for actors scampering around the studio and holding some shot while they do it. You can go faster, and also the.
I was asked to direct a new play of Nigel's. He was great to work with. He was very demanding, and he was, precisely what he wanted. And he was, I think, used to people giving him the respect that was due to him.
No recording was kept of Kneale's 1963 play The Road, but the script shows that he reinvented the ghost story once again. It was set in the past, but had a very contemporary twist.
It's simply set in 1771, a long time ago, and in a small village where they believed there was a haunt in the woods and you might see or hear ghosts.
And you hear these odd sounds and there's flashes of light, and then as it's written, he says, it means nothing to them, but we know what it is, and it's a siren. And then these voices on a motorway, and the road is a motorway.
It's kind of a ghost story turned on its head. The story is of an event which will take place, rather than a conventional ghost story, which is the story of an event that has taken place.
There was the noise of people in cars taking flight along a motorway. And why they were running or driving was to get away from what they knew was about to happen, which is nuclear war.
The sense of panic that people of the 18th century began to understand what it was that their descendants were going to go through struck a huge chord in us, the audience.
The Road is just one of more than a dozen of Kneale's TV plays, which either were never kept or have been lost.
Not very many programmes of the late 50s and the first half of the 60s were saved at all. In fact, there was a kind of practically a policy to wipe in order to be able to save space and to be able to use the tapes once again.
For fans and scholars of television, rather like the burning of the Alexandrian Library, isn't it? The thing that all this stuff once existed and was wasted. But you have to think that maybe at that time television wasn't thought of as a permanent medium. Maybe it was more like the theatre.
Well, if something you've written vanishes and you don't get it shown, because everything I've written is not for publication, they're for watching. And if people weren't able to watch it, then too bad for me. Very disappointing, but there it is. No use grieving over it. It happens. Get on with the next one. Make one that won't be lost.
Kneale's next major play, in 1968, again tackled an apocalyptic theme, and again took an unexpected approach.
It is a time when there was a great worldwide dread of populations exploding out of all control. So my story was about that world having been evaded by the clever device of using pornography to quieten them. In fact, it was about a world of the future when pornography had become compulsory.
They found that if they screened everything and screened it real king style, then basically the audience would make do with that in place of the real thing. Take all experiences secondhand, just sit watching calmly and quietly.
Watch, not do.
Mm-hmm. Watch, not do, that's it.
But when the Sex Olympics run out of steam, the programmers have to find another way to keep the audience docile.
Suppose you've got just a few people to live like old days and watch them to make a show.
The live show.
What I find amazing about it all these years on is it's full of what seem to be specific parodies of what's going on in television now. He seems to have hit on all the rules and the ideas and the notions of reality TV almost before anybody else did, certainly before it actually existed as a genre.
Vision units, set inside and outside the hut. Main unit inside is set in roof. Take care to make no damage to this unit. It is vital to the show.
But it isn't as simple as it looks. There's a plant. Planted on the supposedly deserted island is a murderer, a psychopath. So eventually he kills the woman, the child is dead, and the audience love it.
At the time, it was something in his imagination and his vision. And we probably did not think it very serious. But now to see it again, I see it as a marvellously prescient piece of myth-making.
So ends the first edition of our new show, the Live Show. Soon be others, Bubbies and Coddies, soon be more.
As technicalities become available, somebody will use them. We're seeing that now, I suppose, with Big Brother. Somebody will use techniques which are capable of stimulating people's ideas, brains and so on, being perverted into a peep show.
Kneale's fascination with television technology inspired a fresh attempt in 1972 to rethink the ghost story. The Stone Tape features a group of scientists who are trying to invent a new recording medium, but they discover that the Victorian building in which they're based harbours an additional resident.
I've got something to tell you all. We got a ghost. I've heard it. Collie's heard it. And Jill's seen it.
Now, what is a ghost? You could either say a ghost is make something that frightens us. Oh, that's what we run away. Or you can say this is a phenomenon. If we can bust it, we can discover exactly what it is.
They once had a guard with bell, book and candle. Well, we're rather better equipped. I'm going to chuck the lot at it.
Do you mean go after it with electronics and then...
Find out exactly what makes it... Well, it doesn't tick. It patters its feet and screeches.
The Stone Tape was a ghost story about how, on this occasion, the past is contained within the body of the building.
It must act like a recording, fixed in the floor and the walls. Right in the substance of them, a trace of what happened in there. And we pick it up. We act as detectors, decoders, amplifiers. A recording.
It's obviously a really ingenious idea. It's what, in Hollywood, you could sell as high concept. I mean, it's been done quite a bit since. Poltergeist, I think, owes a bit to it as well. But just the idea of, here's a haunting, but let's get loads of scientists in to investigate rather than a clergyman.
It's there. Can't you hear it?
The fact that it originated with some sort of mysterious ghostly activity is, in a way, irrelevant to the story itself, which is about people. It's not about phenomena, that's secondary, but it is about the people who would do the discovering and what use they'd want to make of it, what money they'd want to make of it, if they could control it. And this is where it gets interesting.
I mean, if I'm right, this could be it. The big one.
A new recording medium?
The boot in the guts of old Nippon.
You
found it! It's fantastic!
But what he doesn't know, none of us know yet, is that, say, a deeper layer in the earth, there's something worse.
And as with Kneale's earlier work, the Stone Tape achieves a chilling climax with a simple but effective device.
I remember the individual sequences being really scary. I mean, the scene at the end where Jane Asher is menaced by what actually turned out to be two lights, but it's still, it's been played at such a hysterical pitch that by the time you get to it, it's two very terrifying lights.
Well, the Stone Tape, as it happened, turned out to be pretty much his last major work for the BBC. He did a drama called Jack and the Beanstalk the following year, and he wrote a play for today called Cracks that ended up being rejected and not made. The way Nigel tells it, he effectively just decided he wanted to change and went to work for ATV. But there is a suggestion that he was dissatisfied with the BBC, dissatisfied with how they were treating his work and how they were producing his work. Effectively from the mid-70s, he went to work for the other side.
Kneale took his most famous creation with him, and a story originally intended for the BBC several years earlier.
It was certainly planned and written too for the BBC, but they gradually went sour on it and said they found it too gloomy.
That's all I'm interested in now. A human face. The child of my own child. I want to see her again. And to hell with all this!
The final Quatermass takes place in this dystopian future where society's broken down and gangs of youths are fighting in the streets and oil is very highly sought after. And Quatermass, as an old man, is featured looking for his young granddaughter who's gone missing. But in fact, he comes to discover that a whole sort of youth cult are heading for stone circles and sports stadiums and other sorts of areas of gathering.
It came out before, I think, the term New Age traveller had been coined. And this sort of idea of kind of post-hippie, post-punk, nomadic gypsies actually did come into being much later. So yet again, he kind of scores on the prophecy meter.
What does it mean to be planet people? What do you believe in?
They think that they're going to be transported from there to a better place, to this alien world. And sure enough, they gather together and a mighty light comes down from the sky. But they're not transported anywhere. They're actually being harvested by an alien force.
So, in the end, he knows what he must do. With the biggest atomic explosion he can engineer, and he's got to be right in there, pressing the button. And he does. End of Quatermass.
Almost 25 years on from the death of Quatermass, Kneale's classic works remain much loved and highly influential.
He was approached to write for the X-Files, which an offer he declined, and it's pretty easy to see a link between the style of he was writing in with Quatermass and what eventually came out to be the X-Files, which has been freely admitted by the makers of the X-Files.
My guess is that almost nobody working in what we might call grown-up science fiction since 1980 is not aware of Nigel. Certainly John Carpenter is a great admirer of Nigel's work and has freely borrowed, I think is the polite way of saying. Stephen King has more or less rewritten Quatermass in the Pit and the Tommyknockers.
It's his eclecticism. It's the fact that gives you permission to do the same thing. He will take things from such disparate sources. He will join the supernatural horror to the H.G. Wells or whatever that makes you think, well, you can do that.
On the unit.
It wasn't a matter of telling stories about the world as it is, but telling the stories of how the world might be if we didn't look out.
You do have a certain talent for guessing. Writing about people just being silly is not interesting, but writing speculation, which can go all sorts of ways, good and bad, murderously horrible, or just enjoyable, but can be drawn out of what's going on today. That's fun.